Good evening. I'm Diane Davis, the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design here at the GSD, and I'm honored to welcome you all to this wonderful event, the annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. This is a very special event for us here at the GSD, but most particularly for my department, Urban Planning and Design. Not just because of the importance of the issue of housing, and in particular affordable housing, to many of the faculty and students in our department, but also because tonight's event has been organized and planned in collaboration with the Joint Center for Housing Studies. This relationship between the Joint Center and Urban Planning and Design is absolutely critical to the mission of our department. And with the intellectual and financial support, as well as the sponsorship of the Joint Center's faculty and research staff, we've been making great strides collectively, I think, in advancing our understanding of the challenges associated with providing housing in the context of just, equitable, and sustainable cities. For precisely that reason, I'm really thrilled that tonight's keynote speaker is Angela Glover Blackwell. But I'm not going to introduce Angela. My job here is to introduce Chris Herbert, the Managing Director of the Joint Center and a lecturer in our department. Chris is a very generous and inspiring colleague and leader of the center. He's also a first-rate scholar, and we are fortunate to have the center in his hands, relatively newly, since 2015. Dr. Chris Herbert has an extensive experience conducting research related to housing policy and urban development, both in the U.S. and abroad, and we've shared some interesting discussions about Mexico, a country that I'm working on, looking at affordable housing with some support from the center. A key focus of Chris's research has been on the financial and demographic dimensions of homeownership and the implications for homeownership policy of the recession, housing bust, and foreclosure crisis. Chris is also an editor of several volumes that focus on housing, but I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Chris's great contributions because there's somebody else waiting in line that we really want to hear a little more about. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris to introduce the rest of our speakers.
Thank you, Diane. I guess this is a named lecture, and so it comes with a certain amount of pomp and circumstance. So I appreciate the series of introductions we've been going through. I do want to thank Diane. The Joint Center works very closely, as she said, with the Department of Urban Planning and Design. And so we were very pleased this past year when Dean Mustafavi appointed Diane chair of the department. As a member of the department, Diane had been a valued colleague and a strong supporter of the center. And now in her new role, I'm very much looking forward to the joint pursuit of our missions to advance education and research on urban issues. And we're also looking forward to engaging the university and the broader community in important policy discussions, such as the event we're here for tonight. So I'm very pleased that Diane was the one who got to introduce us and welcome us to the GSD. On behalf of the Joint Center, it is my privilege to welcome our distinguished faculty, students, and the broader community to the 16th John T. Dunlop Lecture. Among the benefits of this annual lecture is that it provides us with an opportunity to recall and pay tribute to Professor Dunlop for his many important contributions to the world of academia, policy, and industry. John was a remarkable man, marked by tremendous intellect, strategic vision, and unflagging energy. He applied these skills in a long and distinguished career as an academic, a dean, a mediator, a labor secretary, and advisors to presidents over the span of many decades. And among his many accomplishments, Professor Dunlop was also instrumental in helping to support the Joint Center through the years, as he recognized the importance of a Harvard Center that focuses on the centrality of housing, not just in the lives of families and individuals, but also to the building of community and as a vital engine of our economy. And among the many ways that John helped to support the center, perhaps the most notable was that he was instrumental in establishing our Policy Advisory Board, which includes senior executives from leading firms from across the housing industry. And in that regard, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our current Policy Advisory Board members who are meeting here in Cambridge today and tomorrow. It's a pleasure to bring the Policy Advisory Board over here to the GSD after having spent the afternoon meeting at the Kennedy School. And I want to take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge and thank the Policy Advisory Board for their support of the center and for the mission of promoting housing research and education here at Harvard. The timing of the Dunlop lecture to coincide with this annual Cambridge meeting of our advisory board is no accident, as it also pays tribute to Professor Dunlop's goal of bringing together the worlds of academia, policy, and industry to engage in a dialogue, to seek solutions to the nation's most pressing housing challenges. So we're pleased to see so many people here tonight from the university and the broader community. And Professor Dunlop's lasting impact in the world outside the walls of academia is also reflected in the sponsorship of this lecture by the National Housing Endowment. The National Housing Endowment has been sponsoring this lecture since its inception in 1999. We're very proud and grateful to the National Housing Endowment for this 16-year partnership. So in that regard, I have the privilege of introducing to you now Brian Pastore, who's the chairman of the National Housing Endowment, who would like to say a few words on behalf of NHE.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Roger Pastore, Chairman of the National Housing Endowment, and I'm honored to be here this evening amongst the housing professionals and guests as we celebrate the 16th annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. I've already made comments earlier in the day and had the privilege of meeting Angela Glover Blackwell just before we came up here, and I'm looking forward to your remarks this evening, as we all are. This series has welcomed a veritable who's who of the housing industry, and once again, we are privileged to partner with Harvard University and Joint Center for Housing Studies for this event. As Chris said, John Dunlop was a friend and mentor to so many of us in the industry, a champion for labor and management relations, a leader in housing and construction-related industries. The Joint Center and the National Housing Endowment was proud to organize this annual lecture series to honor John's life and commitment to the industry. He's greatly missed. The endowment has always supported opportunities to educate, train, and conduct research in the field of residential construction. Over the course of our history, we've awarded over $13 million in scholarships and grants to support the best and brightest in the home building industry. A great portion of those awards have gone to our flagship initiative, the Home Builder Education Leadership Program, commonly known as HELP. These multi-year grants provide much-needed financial support to colleges and universities to create or expand residential construction management programs and to increase the number of qualified housing management professionals entering this industry. In addition, we are exploring how the endowment can expand our initiatives to address the growing problem of labor shortage that was discussed today in the PAB roundtable. It's a growing issue, and we're seeing how we can help that. In addition to help, the endowment funds doctoral research, joint conferences, seminars, and curriculum development, the annual State of the Nation's Housing Report, and of course, this lecture. Before we begin, I want to recognize two individuals. The first is Isaac Heimbinder, a former trustee of the National Housing Endowment, who has helped the endowment fund this lecture for the past 5 years. And Bernie Gleiberman, who's here this evening, the Policy Advisory Board member who, since 2011, has helped the National Housing Endowment sponsor the State of the Nation's Housing Report. We want to thank both of these gentlemen for their generosity and support. So without further ado, and on behalf of my distinguished fellow trustees of the National Housing Endowment, I welcome all of you here this evening to the 16th Annual Housing Endowment John T. Dunlop Lecture. Thank you. Chris?
Okay, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Angela Glover Blackwell to actually deliver the 16th Annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. Over its history, as Roger mentioned, the Dunlop Lecture has featured a variety of perspectives on critical housing issues and has featured distinguished leaders from the worlds of home building, finance, policy, and advocacy. And collectively, if you look back over those lectures from the past 15 years, it really presents a mosaic of the many ways in which housing is so central to the health of our economy, to the lives of individuals and families, and to the strength of our communities. But if you look at those lectures too, in each individual year, I think you'll see that they highlight issues that are salient, most salient at that point in time. Over the past year, we've seen a number of tragic events and a variety of significant social science research that has drawn our collective attention to the importance of where one lives as a critical determinant of one's opportunities in life, framing as it does your access to jobs and education and ability to maintain your health and to live a safe and secure existence. And ultimately, while those issues seem to conjure up more concerns about education and safety and the like, housing is central to all of these issues. It is housing that is the fundamental link between people and place. Angela Glover Blackwell has long been a leading voice in both drawing attention to the importance of place in creating opportunities in life, and in lifting up examples of what works to create sustainable communities that allow everyone to participate and prosper. Given her nationally recognized leadership in this area, we could think of no one more fitting to deliver this year's Dunlop Lecture. Angela is the Chief Executive Officer of PolicyLink, an organization she founded in 1999 with the mission of advancing economic and social equity. Under her leadership, PolicyLink has become a leading voice in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, education, and infrastructure. Guided by the belief that those closest to the nation's challenges are central to finding solutions, PolicyLink relies on the wisdom, voice, and experience of local residents and organizations. The organization shares its findings and analysis through publications, its website, online tools, convenings, national summits, and briefings with national and local policymakers. Prior to funding PolicyLink, Angela was Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation, and prior to that, she founded Urban Strategies Council, which was involved in community building in Oakland, California. A lawyer by training, Angela worked for a decade in the public interest law firm Public Advocates, dedicated to serving the underserved. She serves on numerous boards, is a frequent commentator for national media, and is the author of several books and articles, including Uncommon Ground, Race and America's Future, and a contributor to Ending Poverty in America, How to Restore the American Dream. Please join me in welcoming Angela Glover Blackwell to deliver this year's lecture, Policy in Place, Building Communities of Opportunity.
Thank you very much. It is an honor, a great honor to do this and deliver this lecture. I appreciate being asked to do it, and I particularly appreciate the topic and the interest that obviously exists around thinking of housing and the way that it impacts our lives. I have personal experience with a lot of the issues that I'm going to be talking about. So I wanted to start off by telling you my personal story, because it took me a long time to realize that my personal story had anything to do with my work. I grew up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s. And I know that segregation and racism there were harsh, from talking to my parents, from reading about St. Louis, from doing research around St. Louis to find out about things that relate to my work. But I didn't personally experience it, because I grew up in a complete Black community where the places where we played and learned and prayed and volunteered were all Black. I rarely came in contact with any people who were not Black. The only time that I did is when my mother would take me downtown to shop, or perhaps when we would go to a grocery store. But for the most part, I lived in a Black community. And while I have lived many places, not just in this country, but around the world, I have never lived any place more integrated than the 4900 block of Terry Avenue. And it was integrated because of segregation. All the Black people lived in the same general community. We lived right in the center of the block. My parents were teachers. To the right, there was a man who had a tiny construction company. I remember whenever he would construct anything, my dad would take us to see it. And it was often so small, and I would wonder, why are we looking at this? And we were looking at it because Mr. Perry's company built it. To the other side, there was a man who was a janitor in a church. Next, on both sides, there were physicians. So I never had to go to the doctor's office. The doctors would just stop by our house for whatever it was that we needed. On the other side of one was a minister. On the other side of the other was another teacher. Across the street, there were multiple family homes. And I remember the Mullins. The father was not there. The mother was on welfare. We called it AFDC back then. There were people who lived on the other side of the street who had other jobs that didn't make quite as much money, but we all lived in the same neighborhood. The block behind us was just as diverse. The block on the other side was a little lower income, but not completely a poor neighborhood. It was interesting growing up in that environment because everything that we needed was there. This was a community of opportunity, despite the fact that it was completely segregated. When our family moved in, we were the second black family to move in, the first having moved in the day before. That was the Perrys. Within 2 years, all of the white people were gone, except for one family. And even though the white people were gone, all of the amenities stayed. We still had grocery stores. We still had drugstores. The park was still wonderful. There was a pool in one of the parks. The neighborhood was safe. Gradually, over time, all of that changed. So by the time my parents moved out of the 4900 block of Terry to join me and my family in Oakland, California, when we went home to visit them, we were appalled at what had happened. There were no grocery stores. By the time I was in college, my parents were driving out to the suburbs to go to the grocery store. The park was not usable. No one would go there to walk. The streets were not safe. The corner store where we had gone just to buy candy had long since closed after the man who ran it had been beat up. And it was a poor neighborhood by that time with all of the things that you can possibly imagine. But I saw what happened. And so when I reflect back on my time in St. Louis, what I think about is how important community was. Community protected the children who were living there from the sting and burn of racism. It wasn't enough for those adults, though. They also wanted us to experience the best that St. Louis had to offer. I remember us going to the outdoor opera, and our parents and the adults would sit around the perimeter protecting us from anybody who might try to diminish us, so that we were still having a black experience even at the outdoor opera. When there was something special at the museum, we had a special docent who took us around to make sure that we saw it. It was an extraordinary experience. It was about place. It was a community of opportunity. And so now when I think about housing, I have no trouble understanding that housing policy is education policy. We went to a good school. It's because of racism again. The reason the school was so good in that segregated neighborhood is because the only thing that the educated adults had that they could choose as professions, for the most part, was to teach. So I had English teachers and Spanish teachers and journalism teachers who in another time would have been senators and Pulitzer Prize journalists and diplomats, but they all taught me and my brothers and my friends. We lived in a neighborhood that had a good school. We lived in a neighborhood where we could walk to school and get exercise. We lived in a neighborhood where there were doctors and physicians and easy access to the health care that we needed. We lived in a neighborhood with a rich and robust social fabric. And that social fabric served as a buffer for the black community. People who could go out and they knew who the people were who were head of the city council, the wards, I forgot what they called it in St. Louis, but they had those political connections. I now go to neighborhoods that are all black and poor, and I see none of that. And I can separate out the fact that even under harsh conditions, living under the racial segregation of the 1950s, it was possible to have a community of opportunity. Where you live in America has become a proxy for opportunity. And for too many people who are of color and low income, there are no opportunities available to them because of their address and their zip code. We have been doing some work around the new rule, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and one of my colleagues pointed out, because she knew us from St. Louis and she's heard me tell my St. Louis story, 2 zip codes in St. Louis. One in which the life expectancy is 16 years longer than the other, and the zip codes are right next to each other. But one is white and the other is black. One in which 52% of the population lives below the poverty level, right there in St. Louis, where you live as a proxy for opportunity. And we have to do something about that. There is an urgency associated with it that requires that we act now, and that we act in the face of complications and complexity, because it's a complex story that I'm standing here telling you. This is a complex story, and we can't let that push us into a single silo and a single strategy. We can't let it cause us to throw our hands up. We have to dig in and figure this out, because this is an amazing moment. I've been doing this work for a long time now. I started working as a professional in the 1970s, and I see now that there's a ripeness for the change that we have all wanted for so long that I have never seen before. The conversation that we're having about inequality is really quite extraordinary. It never dawned on me when Occupy Wall Street first hit the news that we would still be talking about inequality 5 years later, and that rather than becoming something that's turning into commercials, which is usually what happens with the trend in this country, right? First it's an important thing, then it gets in the commercial, and then it's forgotten, right? Well, that hasn't happened to the conversation about inequality. It's gotten broad and it's gotten deep. We've moved away from just talking about the 1% and the 99% to really looking at inequality and racial justice and thinking about these issues in a very deep way. And we're understanding that it's not just inequality, it's toxic inequality. We're experiencing toxic inequality that's hollowing out the middle class, that's baking in poverty, that's stalling social mobility. It's an inequality that we have to be concerned about nationally, not just for a few, but for the many. And we're understanding that inequality, which I have come to understand, was something that was accepted as a good and positive thing by economists for many years, that economists are changing their minds about that. The IMF has done a study of 100 nations and found that for every 10% decrease in inequality, there was a 50% lengthening in a growth period. Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner in Southern California have done a study of 100 regions in the United States and have found exactly the same thing. Reducing inequality expands the period of growth. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland has been making similar pronouncements. So we're at a point where it's not just people who would consider themselves leftists talking about the problems with inequality. The International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve are talking about inequality and how it's bad for growth. We've got that going on. That conversation isn't lessening, and it's getting deeper. At the same time, the tragedy of Michael Brown in Ferguson and Freddie Gray in Baltimore and Eric Gardner in New York, and we could go on with the names. I don't want to take you completely down into that frame of mind, having to think about the worst part of the nation, but coming out of something that has been happening every 28 hours, for who knows how long, that all of a sudden this is a national conversation, that every time it happens it gets on the news and it stays on the news, and people are disaggregating the problem and understanding what's underneath what we're seeing in terms of police killing of black men who are unarmed. The report that came out of the Justice Department and the report that came out of Ferguson have been quite extraordinary in laying bare the racism, the discrimination, the unfairness, the inequity. And people are talking about it. People send me these things. I'll get 5 or 6 copies of the report in a single day. People are talking about it. I rarely go to a dinner, any place, made up of any racial mix, where people aren't talking about it, talking about racism, talking about what it means to be a poor person of color in America. And people are feeling ashamed. And it's a good thing that people are feeling ashamed, because they should. And so we have taken these incidents, once again, Black Lives Matter. I can't breathe. Whatever the phrase might be, it's getting into the culture in a way that people feel that they should be asking themselves whether their profession is a corporate one where they're producing something to sell, whether people are in City Hall, whether it's a civic organization, whatever it is people do, they're asking, what are we doing about this issue that is front and center in America? Maybe at last we can deal with the problem of racism and exclusion and move forward. That's the moment that we're in. It's a moral issue for sure. We knew that Pope Francis would say something about inequality in America. We would have been surprised if he had not, because it is a moral issue for sure, but it is also an economic issue. It is also an issue of democracy. It is also a national issue. And we're understanding that while we always will be talking about providing access to opportunity and inclusion for people because it is immoral to leave them behind, we're starting to realize that the nation is going to be left behind if we don't get this right. Because something else is happening in this moment, and that is rapidly shifting demographics. We assume, it was common knowledge, that by 2050, the majority of people in the United States would be of color. We were quite surprised when we heard the number was really 2042. It's been adjusted now, it's 2044, but it's coming very fast. But for many places, it's already here. Ever since the summer of 2012, the majority of babies born in this country have been of color. The majority of children in the public school system in the United States are of color. The majority of children in this country under 5 are of color. And by the end of this decade, 2019, the majority of all children in this nation, 18 and under, will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color, and by 2044, the majority of people will be of color. But it's even more stark than that, because the median age for people who are white is 42. The median age for people who are Latino, the fastest growing group among groups of color, is 27. And so we have an older population that is white. We have a younger population that is of color. So if you think about schools, if you think about leadership, if you think about work, if you think about workforce, we actually are becoming a nation of color much more rapidly than the census is telling us. Therefore, if we want to be a nation to stand on the world stage proud of our middle class, we have to invest in people of color, because if they don't become the middle class in this country, there'll be no vast and stable middle class. If we really do want to deal with the issues of climate and begin to live in denser populations and use public transportation and reuse our built environment, we're going to have to learn to live together. We're going to have to get used to riding next to, sitting next to, living next to the other. We've got some work to do to get there. If we really want to continue to be able to stand on the world stage in the global economy, we need to take advantage of the most extraordinary asset you could have in a global economy, and that is to be a world city. What could be better than to be connected to the globe through language, through culture, and all of those things? So what has always been a moral imperative has become an economic imperative. And if we are going to be proud of our democracy, it has to be a democracy that can thrive in the face of difference. And so it's also a democratic imperative that we finally get the equity agenda right. What do I mean when I say equity? Just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And we know how to do it. We know it requires affordable housing that links people to opportunity, and that can happen in several ways. People can live in communities that are rich with opportunity because the housing is affordable there. And we can make sure that every community is a community of opportunity, so that the places where people live connect them to good schools, to good jobs, to transit that can connect them to wherever it is they need to get. Where you live not only determines all of those things, but it determines how long you live and how well you live while you live. Connect people to places where they're not around asthma triggers, where they're not suffering the stress and the trauma of the violence that really eats away at health and life expectancy. We can do that, but we also need to make sure that we're thinking about using our transportation policy to connect people to opportunity wherever it might be in the region. We know that it requires investments in infrastructure. We need to do that for the people who are being left behind and left out, but the nation needs to invest in its infrastructure. And if it's going to do that, it needs to do it in a way that produces equity. Asking, where are we putting the infrastructure? Are we putting broadband where we need it? Are we putting transit where we need it? Where are we putting the infrastructure? Are we dealing with the equity agenda as we're making the infrastructure investments? Are we connecting people to jobs? Are we connecting them to apprenticeship programs? We need to ask, are we creating entrepreneurial opportunities for minority and women business people, for who will most likely hire people of color and other women? So we need to think about the jobs as we're thinking about the entrepreneurial opportunities. We know what to do. We know we need to reform our tax code, our tax system. We know the things we need to do. We know that we have to improve our public school system, because if we're not getting ready for the future will leave us behind. So we understand that place matters. Housing is key to place. We have many strategies that we have pursued to try to make sure that we're producing more housing, that the housing is affordable, but we have to ask, are we using housing as a way to improve education? Are we using it to improve health? Are we thinking of housing as a job connector? Are we thinking of housing as a wealth builder for communities that are being left behind? The wealth in the white community is 13 or 14% higher than the wealth in the black community. These are the kinds of things that, unaddressed, will come back to bite the nation, not just because you're leaving people behind, but we need for people to be able to participate. The poverty rate in the Black community is almost 3 times as high as the poverty rate in the white community. The same is true in the Latino community. The unemployment rate in the Black community is more than twice that of the white community. But the question that we need to stop asking ourselves is, we need to stop asking ourselves, how are Black and Latino people doing as against looking at white people? We need to ask, how are Black and Latino and Asian and Native American people doing in relationship to what this nation needs to thrive? That's the measure. And if there's a gap there, that's the gap we need to be concerned about, because that gap hurts us all. When we think about the benefits of equity, it is absolutely essential that we move beyond rhetoric and we begin to look at data. One of the things that we've done at PolicyLink in partnership with Manuel Pastor and his shop at the University of Southern California, which is called the Partnership for Environmental and Regional Equity. So PolicyLink and PEER came together to maximize our organization's strengths. Manuel's shop is basically a data and research shop, but it also does policy and communications. PolicyLink is basically a policy shop and a communication shop, and we also do research. Manuel and I were talking one day just about the time that President Obama was coming into office, and we said, we need to have an organization that has all of the qualities that we have. Why don't we just merge our organizations for the purpose of beginning to tell a narrative to the nation about its future and what we need to do? And so we did. We merged for the purpose of creating the National Equity Atlas. And what the National Equity Atlas does is it looks at 150 regions throughout the United States, 50 states, and the District of Columbia. And what it asks is, what are the changing demographics, and how have they changed over time? What are the indicators of economic well-being disaggregated by race? And what would be the benefit to the nation if we were to correct the problems, if we were to close the gap, if we were to close the gap between the incomes and the earnings of white people and those of people of color? In the part about the shifting demographics, we go from 1980 to 2040, so that you can go to any one of those geographies and see what's going on. One of the things that we have seen, in addition to the shifting demographics, is a racial generation gap. A racial generation gap. 80% of those people over 65 in this country are white, and for about 46% of those under 18 are of color. And that's nationally. But if you go to different regions, you'll see that gap is even greater. And 2 of the places that have the greatest gap are Nevada and Arizona. And if you think about some of the battles that have been going on in that place, you see what happens when you have older voters who do not identify with the youth. They don't identify with the housing needs. They don't identify with the education needs. You have a real problem. So we talk about that in looking at the demographic change. We don't just look at race and ethnicity. We look at age as well. We look at issues that have to do with connectivity and production when we look at the economic issues. But the bottom line is the GDP would be $2.1 trillion higher for the nation if we could close that gap in terms of earnings. And we give that figure for every one of those regions to really underscore that there is something that is really possible going on now, that if we address the issues, we actually are addressing the national issues. And I can't underscore that enough. So we need a policy framework that'll make a difference. We have to think about housing, but we have to think about housing in relationship to the other things that are going to be crucial to respond in this moment in time. And we have to grow good jobs. And we have to grow good jobs, and we have to make sure the jobs that already exist, particularly for low-income people, become good jobs, which is why we celebrate the work of Ajin Poo and the work she's doing around domestic workers, home care workers, making sure that those jobs become good jobs. But when we spend money, once we know that we have an equity imperative, We can't leave it to the poverty program. We can't leave it to the 501c3 organizations. We have to say, how do we advance equity with everything that we're doing? So when Oakland, California finally came up with a plan for what to do with the abandoned Oakland Army base, it had been sitting abandoned for 25 years, one plan after another. Finally, they decided they were going to really invest and make it a logistics center. And in making that investment, they kept asking the equity question. They made a decision that a year before they broke ground, they would put a resource center in the poorest community in Oakland to begin to train people for the jobs that were coming in a year. Don't just wait till the jobs are there and lament the fact that nobody's job ready. If you know what the jobs are going to be, they started training people a year ahead of time. They decided that they were going to set aside 25% of the apprenticeship programs for people who were veterans, people who were long-term unemployed, people who were formerly incarcerated. They decided that all the new apprenticeship programs would go to Oakland residents. And they have a special program to try to deal with vendors and contractors from the communities that are often left behind to try to build that. So using the opportunity to do something the city needed to do anyway to advance the equity agenda. We need to make sure that we're thinking about our infrastructure investments as being an opportunity to advance equity. In New Orleans, they have redone the way that they're routing and the time frame and the schedule for their public transit system to make sure it's connecting people to jobs. Because New Orleans looked up and it saw that over 60%, I think the number is 56, forgive me, 56% of all the black men in New Orleans aged 16 to 64 are without work. Not unemployed, without work. And so Mayor Mitch Landrieu actually developed a plan to build on something that he had been doing to try to deal with violence and the murders. He developed a plan to look at all the jobs they could anticipate coming online, lots of them with anchor institutions, and set up a job training, a job linkage, an educational system to try to make sure that a certain portion of those jobs go to those men. So they were thinking about that, and they realized that they had a transit problem as well. So redoing the routing to make sure that the transit system is working. That we, in the Twin Cities, they put in a light rail, and they made sure that that light rail system did not just displace people. They had an affordable housing strategy along the light rail because they could anticipate that this is going to become valuable property, things are going to happen. Let's secure affordability even before they started on the system. They also put in 3 stops that they had not planned to put in when they originally designed the system so that the entrepreneurs along the way would get the business along the way of the light rail and not have everybody just passing by looking out the window and wondering what that is. People could actually get off. Those are becoming destinations. That's the kind of planning we have to do. We also have to make sure that we are building the capacities of people to be ready for the jobs of the future. By 2018, that's just a couple of years from now, 47% of all jobs in this country will require at least an associate's degree. Only 27% of blacks and Latinos have an associate's degree, and only 14% of recent Latino immigrants. We've got to do something about that, which is what makes the Tennessee Promise an exciting idea. You know, the governor of Tennessee has said that they now are making community college free to anybody who graduates from high school. And then finishing the community college, you can go to the 4-year institution, but you get the 4-year institution for the price of 2 because the first 2 years are free. We need to do more of that, and we need to really make sure we're creating a robust system. But we also have to remove barriers and expand opportunity. Remove barriers and expand opportunity because there are too many things that stand in the way. That's part of what Ferguson and Baltimore have teed up for this country, that we now have a deeper sense of the barriers that have to do with living in a low-income community of persistent poverty than we have ever understood. Never occurred to me that the Justice Department was in cahoots with racism in terms of who had to pay the tickets and who had to support that system. That was shocking even to me. I knew I'd gotten a lot of tickets, but I thought that was just me. I didn't know that this was something that routinely happened. And it happens in jurisdictions all across the country. We're understanding how baked in structural racism is. We have to remove those barriers. We're understanding, thank you, Michelle Alexander, the scandal of incarceration and the new Jim Crow. We knew that there were a lot of people being locked up, but we didn't understand how vast it was and didn't understand how minor so many of the offenses were that got people in again and again and again. And we're starting to undo that. In California, we've passed Prop 47 that has reduced many felonies to misdemeanors. And not only are people no longer getting those felonies on their records, but if you were in jail for a felony that is now classified as a misdemeanor and you have a good record, you are now coming out of the prison system in California. This is a big deal. It's the right thing to do. But we need to make sure that people who do have records are able to access jobs. So the ban the box, so you don't have to check a box on the application for a job, is just the beginning of how aggressive we're going to have to be about incorporating people back into communities. Think about communities. Think about communities where too often we have put the affordable housing. We have put what housing was affordable in communities where the schools were terrible, where there were no grocery stores, where there was no job, where there was no public transit system, but also where there was not robust community and social fabric. Think about all those black and brown men who've been incarcerated. Think about them. Now think about the legacy of absence in the communities from which they were snatched. The legacy of absence. No fathers, no community role models, no partners, nobody. My father used to play stickball with every kid in the neighborhood. Nobody to do that. Think about that legacy of absence. We've got a lot to make up for. It takes more than a house. It takes a community. It takes people. It takes people investing in each other. It takes access to opportunity. We've got to remove barriers, and we have to build opportunity. And the good news is that as we think about those who are most vulnerable, as we develop strategies to make sure that equity includes them, we are creating benefit for everyone. And for me, the best example of that is something that every person in this room has experienced. That's the curb cuts. The curb cuts in the street. Those curb cuts are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities. Happened in Kalamazoo in the 1940s, never happened again until Ed Roberts and his colleagues in Berkeley in the 1970s began to actually be aggressive advocates for getting those curb cuts so they could actually realize the rights that people with disabilities had been able to gain. And so those curb cuts are now every place in every city across this country. And they are there because of people with disabilities being advocates for them. But how many times have you been pushing a baby carriage and been so happy you didn't have to pick up that contraption? How many times have you, like me, been pulling a suitcase and you made that train because you could just keep going? How many times have workers had their burden eased, been pulling wagons and pushing carts because those curb cuts were there? How many times have you had your shoulders come down and your mind relax when that new bike rider was traversing the neighborhood sidewalk to sidewalk and not riding in the streets? But I bet you didn't know this. Those curb cuts have saved lives because the curb cuts oriented people to go to the corner to cross the street. They were supposed to go to the corner, but the curb cuts orient you to exactly where it is to go, save lives in that sense. The curb cuts are an example of when you solve problems for people who are the most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. You solve them for everybody. And that's the moment we have now with equity. Whether we're thinking about education policy and how to make sure we have a robust public education system that educates children for 21st century jobs with the nation needs to compete, but we know who we have to educate, we know who we're leaving behind. Whether we're thinking about transportation policy that connects people to jobs and we actually can tap our full workforce, which we need to be competitive. Whether we're thinking about housing, we're thinking about housing in communities of opportunity that is affordable. We're thinking about strategies in places where we have affordable housing to make sure they're communities of opportunity. And as we finally accept that even in America, cities are coming back, places where we have been throwing them away for decades, they are coming back. As we begin to invest in those cities, Assume that you're going to be successful. Know that you're part of the wave of a resurgence of cities. Bake in affordability right from the beginning, and we won't have to worry about gentrification. We won't have to worry about people being displaced because of it. And as you're thinking about anything you do, think about jobs, because the best way to build a mixed income community is to increase the incomes of the people who already live there. That's the very best way to do it. Think about jobs in all of those instances, because we're at a moment where to unlock the promise of the nation, we have to unleash the promise in all of us. That's where we are now. Thank you. Thank you for that. But I have a little time to answer questions if you have any. I hope you do. I can use this? Good. And step here.
If you were suddenly empowered and you had the ability to make a major policy change that would further many of the issues you just discussed so eloquently, what would that single policy change be?
That's always a tough question because we need to do so much. I don't think I can responsibly answer that question without talking about education, because we all know how important education is. And we know that education should be cradle to career. We're not talking K-12 anymore. We're talking cradle to career. If we really made the investment from cradle to career, and we made sure that every child born has the opportunity to reach his or her potential, that we made sure that their parents can go in and get re-educated, can get educated for the first time. We made sure that we actually assume that children can learn whatever it is they need to learn. We would transform the nation. Now, there are other things we need to do, but if you make me pick one, I've got to go to education. Yeah. Now, if you give me 5, I get it all in. Yes. You need, may I take you the mic? Thanks.
Thanks. You gave us a very, I think interesting story, your own personal story, and talked about the changing demographics of your neighborhood and the community there. And one of the things I want to ask you about is the impact of the Inclusive Communities decision in the Supreme Court over the summer. Because I think as some of these urban communities we've seen a lot of reinvestment happening, and you touched on gentrification, and I think one of the other trends that we're going to see, and we've begun to see, is that communities of color and low-income communities are being pushed out into inner-ring suburbs and suburban areas. And I think in some sense, this is really what the Inclusive Communities decision is about, is trying to encourage mixed income and mixed race communities in suburban areas. So do you think that is going to be an important trend that we're going to see, and what sort of policy implications is that going to have, both for continuing urban reinvestment if we have not as much funding coming into some of the disinvested urban communities, and then what policy ramifications does that have also for some of the suburban communities where we're going to see an increase in affordable housing being developed?
So one thing to point out is that the trend of Black and brown people moving to suburban communities has been going on for a long time. Black and Latinos stayed in cities, and they kept hanging in there, and they kept hoping they would get better, and the schools got so bad, the streets got so dangerous, people left. And so it didn't surprise me one little bit that it was Ferguson and not St. Louis. Didn't surprise me one little bit, because you actually tend to get uprisings when people are hopeful in doing the right thing. When we had the uprisings after the civil rights legislation is passed, going to Watts and other places, lots of people were shocked because they felt that the country was making progress. We were passing civil rights legislation. People had rights and things they'd never had before, and that's when Watts opened up. So it didn't surprise me that it was Ferguson, because people moved to Ferguson trying to do the right thing, trying to get away from St. Louis, trying to find places where the schools would be better, where they would have more jobs, where they would be respected. And they didn't find any of that. They found schools that were now being underinvested in, police who were harassing them, no jobs available. And so it's been going on for a long time. That's why we actually have so many people now in the suburbs who are poor. We actually have more people poor in the suburbs than we have in cities. So it's been going on for a long time. The question is not moving to an area that has been previously white or moving to an area that's suburban. What we need is for people to move to opportunity. A friend of mine, John Powell, when he was at the Kirwan Institute, they actually did a study that showed that people who were black and brown were moving away from opportunity when they left cities, not moving to opportunity. They were moving to declining inner ring suburbs while the opportunities were elsewhere. So I hope that what we will see is more resources available for people to have information, to move to opportunity when they are making a move, and not just move to the place where they happen to know someone, which is likely the reason you know somebody there is because it's not an opportunity community. People move from the place you know to a place that's already on its way down before you move there. The other thing we need to really focus on is making sure that the bottom line is connecting people to opportunity. Therefore, if a community is becoming a community of opportunity, it is the right thing to do to figure out how to keep people there who were there during the bad time. They deserve to be there during the good time. Just makes no sense to have grocery stores coming in, schools starting to improve, relationships with the police getting better, and the very people who were crying and begging and fighting for that can no longer live there. So we have to not be knee-jerk in the way that we think about this. We need to be informed, we need to be thoughtful, and we need to have goals that we're trying to get to and a way to measure whether or not we're doing it. Yes?
You talked a lot about the complexity of the issues, and not to, I'm in the school of public health.
Mm-hmm.
So the issues that you talked about are health and education and housing, and how complex it is now. It's very easy to walk away, but we're here with a lot of housing professionals. But if we go over to Fenway or Longwood area, we're with a lot of public health professionals. If we go somewhere else, we're at the school of education. Can you talk about how to break silos so we don't just talk about where we live, learn, work, and play matters, but how do we actually professionally, when we're being trained in silos, we're really have departments professionally in silos, so we're not really working interconnectedly, only when it makes very obvious sense, like asthma and housing in some places, but not really to address the fundamental issues that you've discussed.
I actually feel that what you have pointed out is true and changing. I don't know how fast it's changing, but I know that it's changing. One of the things that's causing it to change is the notion of collective impact. The idea of collective impact, which really forces you to identify the outcomes that you want, and then think about all the actors who have to participate to get to those outcomes. It's interesting to me that collective impact is what people in communities have always understood, that they have always tried to tear themselves apart to fit into a conversation with a case manager over in social services, and then fit in with a public health nurse over at the public health department, and then go to somebody else who was supposed to be doing that in the school system. People knew that their issues were intertwined, interrelated, and you couldn't talk about one without the other. Collective impact is now caught up with the insights that people in community have always had, and they're trying to figure that out. So that once you get out of school into the workplace, the people who will soar are the ones who get it. Because there's not much use now for people working in cities or in counties who don't understand the interrelationships. People who can talk the language of housers and talk the language of public health and understand the contribution of public interest lawyers and talk to people who are making transportation decisions. Those are the ones who rise to the top. Those are the ones who get the promotions. Those are the ones who move forward. And so I think that pressure to be trained for the real world, where for the real skill, for the real things that are valued, I think that's starting to happen. I know there are lots of programs now in professional schools where people are crossing silos, but there are many things moving in that direction and some fabulous examples. I always recommend King County in Washington as a place where they really are on top of this. But at Alameda County in California and other places, I'm seeing extraordinary stuff. Yes?
You mentioned Baltimore.
Yeah.
My family and I live in Baltimore. We moved to Baltimore, my wife and I did, in large measure, and at the time or just after the riots of 1968. What do you say to us? Between my wife and I, we've probably been on or chaired a dozen boards. We have many friends who've contributed a great deal of time, energy, and money to try and to improve education, social programs, and housing in Baltimore. And here we are 45 years later, and the same thing happens that had happened in 1968. Why shouldn't we just give up?
I hope you don't give up. Same story could be told every place. My husband and I have lived in Oakland, California for 35 years. And when we first moved there, we got involved and we've been involved. And Oakland is now one of those communities that's starting to be gentrified. And so we're fighting that fight now. But we have never invested as we should to try and solve these problems. That when we had the uprisings in Baltimore and Detroit and in Los Angeles and all these other places, the response has never been to peel away the onion and understand at the core what is wrong and how do we fix it. We haven't done that before. And so there's no reason to give up with the notion of this can't be fixed. The question is, why don't we step up to fix it? Because we know what it takes. We are not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one. We are not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one. It's going to take a lot of money to fix the problems in Baltimore. The schools are terrible, and it's going to take a lot of money to fix those schools. The housing is not housing, it's not opportunity housing. It's not in places where young people can feel safe. What's happened between the police departments and young people has been going on for decades. I know something about the efforts that Johns Hopkins has made to try to use what it's doing to engage and train, but they're not doing nearly enough. They're not doing nearly enough. It's going to take more than the hospital to solve that problem. That there's a lot of money getting spent in Baltimore around various things, and if you go and you look at who's working on the sites and who the contractors are, you realize that we're still missing opportunities. And so my response is it has to be frustrating when you come back to the table again and again and again. But if you ask yourself, have we ever had a real honest conversation about how we got here? I taught a class at NYU around housing in 21st century, race, class, housing in 21st century American cities. And one of the things the students did was they looked at the redlining maps. And then they looked at communities of concentrated poverty, and they were exactly the same. They were exactly the same. How could that be? So we haven't really talked about racism. We haven't peeled back that onion. We haven't done a true assessment of what it's going to take. We haven't allocated the money to do what it's going to take. And until we do that, we're going to keep fooling around. I contend, though, that this might be the last chance that we have to get it right. That this is the moment. We're talking about inequality. We're talking about race. We're having the demographic change happen. We have decades of finding out what works. Decades. We have been working on this with foundation dollars, with special government programs, with faith-based programs. You show me a problem, and I can show you some place where they found what works. What we need to do is disaggregate it, understand it, put it in policy, and take it to scale. Here's one other thing we didn't have all the other times we've been working on it. I am amazed at the people who are leading foundations these days. They are people of color, but not just people of color. They are people of color and people who are white who have been in the business of creating change. It's not just the lawyer for a wealthy family. You know, it is people who really know what works, and they're working together and they're pushing their money out there. When you look at the kinds of positions that people are in now to be able to really influence what happens, we also have a cadre of leaders who are committed with capacity. I think we have everything we need. What we're lacking is the public will and the political will, but we can build that. With time?
Please join me in thanking Angela. So I think with that, our evening is adjourned. Thank you very much for coming to tonight's lecture. As I said, the lectures collectively provide a mosaic of housing issues, and Angela has really, I think, provoked a lot of thought about the way in which housing creates opportunities in different communities. So thank you very much for coming.